All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third webinar for this week. Yesterday, we had an overview of what research needs to be conducted and some of the basics that you need to know in terms of starting your research project. This evening, we're going to be talking about methodology, and Dr. Damir Mitric is here with us again, who's going to be guiding us through webinar number 3. Thank you, everyone, for coming and joining online. For those of you that are not here with us, you'll have this recording on LMS and via email as well. So, Damir, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Eddie, and thanks everybody for joining us again. I'm pretty excited about this webinar because it's probably arguably the most important one in the series that we are doing this week, and that's because we're going to be focusing on methodology and methods. And the reason why this is so crucial and important is because it's going to be the core element of your reports that you're going to be writing, and indeed there will be an entire section of the report which will be dedicated to methods. But more importantly is that the methods and the methodology will actually set you up on the journey in the beginning, and doing it properly is integral, because if you do this part incorrectly or not in the best way, then essentially your entire project will be jeopardized. As a little bit of context, we are actually going to cover this topic from a technical writing perspective in a lot of detail on Friday, because I'm going to run you through the 4 elements of a major parts of the main part of the research report, and of course methods and methodology will be one of those. So today it's not really about finding out how to write a method section of your report. It's actually just to give you a bit of an understanding of what it actually is, and to get some of the juices flowing in terms of your imagination and starting to think about what a potential research project of yours could look like. I thought it was really interesting, the discussion that we had at the end of yesterday's seminar, because most of the questions, and you asked some really good questions of Eddie, were actually all around methodology and methods, and particularly I think that one question around I think it was Campbell's example, and about the production line, and whether that is asking you to think about sort of through a managerial lens, or is it actually a question around specific to engineering? Is it an engineering type of problem? And I thought that was really fascinating, because it was exactly hitting the methodology and methods points. So hopefully what we can do today is have another discussion like that. I thought that the examples that you gave were very good, because everybody else could relate to them. So I'm going to try to keep this one a little bit shorter, and also to give you a bit of a heads up, I'm going to speak kind of freely at the beginning of this presentation, but I will kind of try to stick to the script as much as I can when I start explaining the methods part of it, because it is not necessarily easy to understand for you, and I don't want to actually use this webinar to confuse you even more. So it's not what I naturally would do. I'm naturally a very free speaker, but for the methods part of it, when I give you the 3 examples of how you can approach a project, I'm actually going to try to stick to the script, and then finish hopefully within 1 hour, which means that we're going to have much more time at the end to actually get you to ask some really good questions, and then we can explain the methods through your questions, which will be much more authentic and make much more sense for you. So as you can see, this is the overview. We're going to essentially go over 4 points. We're going to look at what is methodology, and then try to think about what is the difference between methodology and methods in the first place, which is not always very easy, even for people who are experienced. And then we're going to look at what are some of the predominant methodologies that are used in engineering, which doesn't mean that you have to strictly speak and stick to those, but it is probably more or less likely that you will be working in those methodologies. And then we're going to run through 3 types of research methods: experimental research, quasi-experimental research, and survey research. And then in relation to the survey research, I really would like to run through some of the very classic observational errors that can occur, because that is something that will not necessarily be natural to you as engineering students if you do opt to do some research, some surveys as part of your research. So let's dive into it. Okay, So what I'd like to do now is try to actually explain to you the difference between methodology, research methodology, and research method. And I've tried sort of very hard to think about how I can do that and visually represent it. And I've come up with this cartoon which I found online, which I think is sort of fantastic. As you can see, we've got someone wearing the t-shirt, World's Best Grandpa, and then the question being asked, well, I'm not sure what methodology was used to actually to make that claim. And I really like this cartoon, and I'm going to follow up with another one in the next slide, which hopefully will help me to land the points that I'm trying to land here. So let me tell you now, I'm going to try to do this really in kind of 2 sentences, the difference between methodology and method. And let me tell you something from the beginning. Often when you do an online search, you will see that people talk about methodology versus research method, so methodology v method, which is a really crazy way to think about it because it is actually part of the same process, but they're different components of the same process. Methodology is your theoretical and philosophical framework that you're using in order to frame a particular research project. So it's the theoretical and philosophical framework of your project. And this has an epistemological dimension. And epistemological dimension, what I mean with that is the question, how do you know what you know? So how do you know what you know? How do you conceptualize the knowledge? What is the theory? What is the philosophy that you're trying to refer to when you're actually creating knowledge in the first place? So methodology is the umbrella term, if you like. It's the big picture. Methods, on the other hand, are the technical or procedural rules, if you like, that you employ to generate your data, right? So you can see that methodology is actually something much broader. It's the way that you make sense of knowledge. And you will have to pick a particular theory or philosophy that you adhere to, that you believe in, when you're trying to solve a problem. And the problem that you're solving, or the hypothesis that you're going to be testing, you're going to be testing within this particular, within this bubble, within this web of meaning that you're creating. The method is the technical aspect, as I said. These are the procedural parts. It's the doing part of your study, the sampling, the data collection, the data analysis, ethics, etc. But you can't dive into the doing part of it if you don't actually understand how you're going to create knowledge in the first place. So you can see when you look at this cartoon of the World's Best Grandpa, the question that before you think about, data collection, analysis, how you would analyze, create data in the first place to verify this claim, the first question you would ask yourself actually is, well, what kind of theory or philosophy am I going to be looking at in order to do that? And a simple way to look at it is, are you going to use words or are you going to use numbers? And that takes us more or less to the next part here, which is to explain now. We're going to focus now on research methodology. So we're going to talk about methods, the technical, the doing part in a moment. But before we do that, I'd like to just quickly dive a little bit into what is actually research methodology. And by the way, we could spend an entire semester, we could have an entire semester subject, which, for example, if you were in a school of education, you would spend 2 semesters just doing methodology methods. So we're doing this in an hour. So this is a very, very basic sort of overview. And I'm trying to keep it very simple, but still give you a very good understanding of what it actually is. Methodology, we usually divide into sort of two camps, if you like. So we either think about methodology, which is qualitative, or methodology that is quantitative. So let's try to figure out what the differences are. And I've given you a kind of cartoon, as you can already see, which follows up from the first one, which is our grandpa sitting on the bench. So qualitative research is associated with the use of words, sounds, images, and objects as the data for research. And the interpretation of the data can be very, very subjective. And I'm very, very used to this part, and I'll give you some examples in a moment, because as a historian, and I already introduced myself as a historian in the last seminar, I will usually swim in this particular area. So I will be looking at words and sounds and images, and thinking about ways how we can make sense and how we can create concepts out of these. So the contrast if we look at quantitative research, it's actually associated with numbers, numerical data, obtained from experiments, surveys, or past records, and the interpretation of the data is regarded as more objective. So that's why we often will get the clash. So to give you an example, I had in my previous role, I worked as a academic developer. So I was designing curriculum and doing professional development for people that are teaching at university. And we were made of interdisciplinary teams. And we would always have these clashes with psychologists, because I had a colleague in my unit who was a psychologist, and he could not understand how what we were doing in the qualitative space is scientific research at all. Because for him, the only way that he could make sense of a concept is if you used actual raw data, if you used numbers, if we created a hypothesis at the beginning and then we tried to test it. He could not live with the fact that you can actually do it the other way around. And when I, in the next slide, explain to you a little bit more, in a little bit more detail, the difference between this qualitative and the quantitative world. As I put there, according to Porrego, theory is applied early in quantitative research to identify a hypothesis and to select suitable methods of data collection, whereas theory is applied much later in qualitative research to interpret the findings. And that is why my colleagues had such real big problems, because what we would try sometimes, what we would do is record a lot of interviews with people, and then we'd start analyzing the data that we've created in order to come to a point where we think that we've started to make sense of the data, and then we will look for theory in order to verify or to create meaning around the data sets. And he could not live with the fact that you would not go to theory first in order to actually make a hypothesis and then spend 6 months trying to prove or prove the point. So either verified or not verified the hypothesis that you have started working in the beginning. So, I think I quite like this, the drawing that you can see. As you can see there, let's get a show of hands. Who here prefers quantitative data over qualitative data? And we've got some hands up, and then, someone starts talking, and then, of course, there's the interception. Oh, sorry, I should have mentioned, please only use numbers in your response. And then, the response is 7, which completely makes no sense. So that's what can happen if you don't actually figure out at the beginning of your research project what kind of theoretical, philosophical pathway you're taking. Are you going down the qualitative pathway, or are you going down the quantitative pathway? Or are you going down a pathway that we would call the mixed research method, which is taking both into equation? So looking at both philosophies in order to make sense of things, but very likely that most of you will not be in that camp, and we will not be covering this today. So before we get into to talk about engineering specifically, here is a sort of a nice little slide that can help us to kind of clarify some of these differences that I've started to talk about in terms of methodology, and we can just sort of run through that very briefly. So on the left-hand side, we have the quant data, and on the right-hand side, we have qual. So with quant, the objective is to test the hypothesis, as I already told you, that the researcher generates. So you generate the hypothesis at the beginning, and the entire point of the project is to actually try to test that hypothesis. Whereas in qualitative research, your objective is to actually discover and encapsulate meaning once the researcher understands the data. So a lot of the effort at the beginning, the front loading, is in actually trying to make sense of the data first. So it's actually completely reversed in terms of the sequencing. And again, that is the example that I've used with my colleague who is a psychologist and working with me as a historian, where we simply, our two worlds kind of collided. And then the other difference is that concepts, these generalizations about anything really, in quantitative research, they form, they are in the form of a distinct variable, whereas in qualitative research, concepts tend to be in the form of themes, motives, and generalizations, and even taxonomies. And I've introduced you to taxonomy in the previous webinar when we talked about Bloom, and we looked at the pyramid. So having said that, the idea of qualitative research is still to generate the concept. It's just that it is done in a completely different way to what you would do in the quantitative field. And also, it is much more fluent. It's not as static as it is in quantitative research, which is why a lot of people have a lot of issues with it. So it's kind of like using your left and right brain a little bit. There's this sort of division of how we make sense of the world. Another difference is that measures are systematically created before data collection and are standardized as far as possible in quantitative research. Whereas in qualitative areas, measures are more specific. And they're a lot more specific to the individual setting or even to the researcher. So they can be much more kind of subjective. It's much more objective in quantitative research. And I already mentioned that, that the data is always in the form of numbers. So the simplest way to understand the difference is to think about quantitative research is really data-driven. I mean, both are data-driven, of course, but it's very much about precise measurements that are using numbers, whereas in qualitative, you're actually using words, which of course are very subjective because they need to be interpreted. So there's a huge, huge difference there. And the other huge difference is how you apply theory. Theory in quantitative research is applied at the beginning, and it is very deductive. So you go from the generalized conclusion that is known to be true. So you have this generalized conclusion that you refer to that is known to be universally true, and then you try to go from that general universal truth to a specific conclusion that you're working on. Whereas in qualitative research, you actually start with a specific, and then you go to make a generalized conclusion. So that's what we call inductive reasoning. So that's the difference between one is deductive, the other one is inductive. And again, if you use that example of my colleague and me, you can see how two worlds can be colliding, because he will be saying to me, well, hang on a second, you're starting with this really small example, and now you want to tell me about how the world functions based on that. No, sorry, that's not how it works. We need to go the other way around. So sorry, guys, somebody's got their microphone on, so if you could just all mute them, that would help me, because I can hear something in the background. So just to cover the last two very quickly, and then because we do need to move on. The other difference is that in quantitative research, your procedures are very much standard, and you're assuming that you can replicate things, over and over again. Whereas in qualitative, the procedures are very particular, and they're actually very difficult to replicate, because a lot of the research is generated will be very specific to a particular case or an instance, and therefore it's very difficult to actually replicate something. So you can already see what implication that has for what methods you're using to generate data. And then the last point, which is very important because we're going to talk about it on Friday, is that you're going to have to use a lot of statistics, tables, and charts in order to relate the data to hypothesis when you're in a quantitative space. Whereas that is not necessarily the case with a qualitative research. So I hope that sort of gives you a really good sense. Let me repeat where we're up to now. We only so far talked about methodology. So we've spoken about this theoretical and philosophical framework of your particular research project. And the point I've tried to land here is that you have two pathways there when you're making the decision of how you make sense of knowledge and meaning. That one is the quantitative pathway, the other one is the qualitative pathway, and we've looked now at how that decision will influence your actual methods. And that's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to actually start talking about methods, but before we do that, we want to look at what does a classic research project look like in engineering. So that's going to be the pathway now that we're going to take. So that is the next slide, which more or less tells you in sum that, in engineering, you usually tend to be in the quantitative research space. So it's very unlikely to find yourself in the qualitative space. It's not to say that it's impossible that you'll find yourself. You can, and you might, depending on your particular context. But generally speaking, the research that you will be undertaking is quantitative research. Which is very lucky for you, because setting up quantitative research is much easier than it is to set qualitative research projects, because you have, as you can imagine, a lot more things to think about if you're in the qualitative space. You need to design much more carefully, and you need to think about your methods very carefully, so that you're actually generating data that can be considered to be meaningful and valid, and that you actually can say that you have a consistent and coherent picture that you're creating in order to have a hypothesis. So the only way that you find yourself in that space is if you're looking at case studies, really. But we can discuss that at the end of in the question and answer section, and Eddie, I'm sure, will have something to say to this as well. And partly this was also raised yesterday when that example was given about that particular Campbell example, and what you're actually looking at. Is it management or is it engineering? And then that would actually have quite a bit of an impact in terms of the methods that you're using, and hopefully you'll have more of these questions to ask. But as I said, most of you will usually be in the quantitative space. Now, having said, why have I now then told you about all of these differences? Well, the reason I've told you is because usually what people tend is just to say, well, I don't have to know about the other stuff. I'm an engineer. I need to just focus on this particular thing. And that is quantitative research. Tell me about the 3 different ways to do it and why you're wasting my time with the other stuff. Well, the reason that I've opted not to do that, and indeed the book that I'm basing this webinar is also suggesting not to do that, is because that's a very pedestrian way to think about how you're generating data, actually how you're living as a professional. So it's very important to actually understand your particular philosophy, why it exists, to be able to talk about it and explain it to yourself and to others. And also, it is important to understand that there is another alternative way to generate data, and you might come across situations where that will help you to be much more innovative than somebody else who's not trying to think outside the box. So living in the 21st century, living in this global world that we're living in the interdisciplinary world, it's actually really important to think much more broadly. And that's why for you, in a way, it's very lucky to have somebody like me deliver this particular seminar than maybe somebody who is strictly speaking in the engineering tradition, because we're covering the same things, but I can offer you then, alternative ways of thinking, which hopefully will make you a better engineer and actually be able not only to solve problems, but imagine problems that others can't even see in the first place. So that's engineering. So we've now established that more or less we will be functioning. So the rest of the presentation will be heavily focusing on quantitative research. And now what we're going to do is to look at the methods that normally, so these, remember, the methods are the technical procedural rules that you will employ to generate your data. So we've now established that you're going to be in the quantitative methodology side of things. So now we're going to look at the methods that you can employ. So the methods that you can employ, the technical procedural rules that you'll be employing to generate your particular data. So the doing part of your study. And what I'd like to do now is actually kind of really try to stick to the script fairly more or less strictly, because for 2 reasons: we can finish on time, and also I don't veer off, because it's very important that you understand this part. Because it will have a big influence in terms of how you move on with your project. So before we go into talking about the 3 types, here's a slide that's sort of generally explaining what a research method is. So research should be always based on the scientific method, and it's sort of generally kind of agreed that that method has 6 to 8 stages, and the one that I've provided you with here is the Hitchcock and Hughes description, which talks about 8 stages. So they say that a scientific method is always consistent of 8 stages. So firstly, you need to state the problem. Secondly, there needs to be a design of an experiment. Data needs to be collected, samples at least, and identified, as well as, you need to collect samples and you need to identify the variables, which is very important. Remember, we're in the quantitative field here. Variables are very, very important to it. Because remember when we talked about concepts and how concepts are designed, we spoke about the difference between quant and qual. So Second, again, to repeat, design the experiment, collect samples, and identify your variables. Number 3, observe correlations and identify the patterns. 4, you need to form a hypothesis to explain the regularities that you're finding. 5, you test explanations and predictions. 6, you develop laws or reject a hypothesis. And 7, you make generalizations. And then ultimately, potentially, you'll be forming new theories, if applicable. So in this webinar, so these are the 8 stages. In the rest of the webinar, we're going to discuss research method in the following way. So we're going to talk about experimental, quasi-experimental, and survey research from the engineering perspective. So now we're moving really into specifically to engineering, and we're going to basically look at these 3 types of research methods: experimental, quasi-experimental, and survey research. And again, as you're listening to this, you can try to think about if you already are in the right place and if things already have been discussed, and clearly some of you already been in that place, you can sort of start thinking about some of the suggestions that have been done and how you may or may not be able to utilize some of these methods that I'm talking about. And then we're going to have 30 minutes where you can ask questions and share with everybody else and see how we can solve it. Okay, so firstly, we're going to talk about experimental research. So experimental research involves research to determine causal relationship or testing cause-effect hypothesis. A cause-effect relationship is one where the occurrence of an event, so the cause causes the occurrence of another event, what we call the effect. And to establish a cause and effect relationship, 3 conditions must be present. And look, I do apologize if for some of you this seems sort of very basic, and because many of you would have been immersed in data like this, obviously as engineers. But we are going to run through it anyway from a research project perspective, because it's important that you understand the different elements of it. Because you're going to have to write a report, and there is a bit of a formula that you need to follow in terms of the methods. So we're talking about the cause and effect relationship, and we're talking about the fact that you need 3 conditions that need to be present. So firstly, when the cause occurs, the effect must flow, and this is what's known as the temporal precedence. Secondly, whenever the cause occurs, the effect must also occur. And the stronger the cause, technically the stronger will be the effect. And this is also known as the covariation. So thirdly, the effect must be due to the cause, and no other cause can explain the effect. And that is a really important part, because if you don't hit number 3, then you need to ask yourself, well, what else could be the cause? And you can see how important it is how you actually set up your experiments in the first place, and how you think about that you're going to be generating the data. And just kind of to tell you now how we spoke early on that it might be a little bit easier to be functioning in the quantitative space versus the qualitative space, which is generally speaking true, because the quantitative space is much more structured and it has rules. At the same time, when you do things wrong in the quantitative space, then you really shot yourself potentially in the foot somewhere, because you might have spent a lot of time on something, but if you haven't set up the data collection or hypothesis, etc., correctly in the first place, then you can have a problem. Or if you've missed something, so if you've missed a variable that you didn't see, or a cause that might have an influence, then you actually got a lot of problems. Whereas in the qualitative space, issues like that can still be merged into the research methodology itself, into the methods. So the fact that you've made a mistake can then lead you to another kind of insight that you've gained, and you can spin it on and on in this way. So you have to be very careful. If you're setting experiments up, it needs to be done properly. And there's also a note there saying that experiments can be conducted using standard as well as non-standard procedures. And you probably be already aware about some of these standard procedures that your lecturers have been referring to. I mean, in this slide I've got the ISO, the American Standards of Testing, and the British standards for measurements of a test variable. But you might be, you might have been functioning in other spaces, and your businesses might be working with other standards. The fact is also that there's a non-standard procedure, but be aware when using those non-standard procedures that the development part of those is a very important part of the actual research that you're undertaking. So if you're designing something specifically, then you need to be very careful how you're setting up, how you're setting those standards, because again, there's some potential to shoot yourself in the foot, and that's where you need to be very, very closely with both your supervisors, especially I guess the academic supervisor, but also your supervisor in the industry. Okay, so I think I've listed 7 important considerations that you need to actually take in experimental research, and we'll just quickly run through those, and then you'll have an opportunity later on to read them in your own time. So the first 3 are listed on this slide. First one is dependent and independent variables need to be present in all experiments. So these variables need to be first identified so that the experiments can be designed to show the cause-effect relationship between the independent and dependent variables. And by systematically varying one dependent variable while keeping the other dependent variables constant, the cause effect of the dependent variable can be determined in a parametric study. So you need to be aware of the fact that you need to have both in your experiments. Second one is the probability sampling methods, which need to include simple random sampling, cluster sampling, stratified sampling, systematic sampling, and multi-stage sampling. And the minimum sample size in probability sampling can be computed based on whether the population size is known or unknown. So when it is not possible to follow the recommended minimum sampling size, and usually that's 30 samples should be used. Now, I think there is also, Jed Campbell explains this recommendation is in why is 30 the magic number for sample sizes, and I think there is a link that we have embedded as well, which you can look at, and perhaps Eddie, you can add to that as well later on. But I think that's a really important thing to think about if you're going to do experimental research, whether you can actually generate enough, so whether you can have enough random sampling or not, and how much time and you have at your disposal to pull it off. And then number 3 is a control experiment is needed to establish that the effect is due to the cause and no other causes can explain the actual effect. So by comparing the measurements from the control experiment with the other experiments, the reliability of the result can be increased. And again, that's very important in terms of making sure that you're generating enough valid data in order to draw your conclusion, because ultimately you're going to have to make some conclusions based on the data that you're generating. And number 4 is repeatability and reproducibility must be demonstrated in experimental research. And again, remember that that's very different to qualitative methodology, where usually you'll be working on something very specific, and it's going to be very unlikely that something very specific can be replicated. Well, since you're going to be functioning in quantitative research space, you actually need to be able to reproduce and repeat whatever you actually are working on. So that's a very important thing, to consider. Number 5, accuracy and precision refers to the reliability of the measurement. So accuracy refers to the measurement error between the measured value and the actual value, and precision refers to the closeness of the 2 measurements. So good experimental data should be both accurate and precise. And again, this would be sort of a common sense thing that I'm sure you've already been, principally you've been already exposed to in your studies. Number 6, estimation of uncertainty is required as all measurements involve some error, which is technically known as the uncertainty. An experiment should provide some measurement of the uncertainty. And the last one is the ethical issues, which I guess for you, normally that refers to living subjects, and but the fact that you will be in a company, that point I guess already has been raised by Abby last week in terms of thinking about the fact that you are actually working in a business setting, and that whatever you actually set up, you need to think about what data you can actually use, whether it's sensitive data, whether it can be shared, etc. So this is not a technical sort of ethical issue, a typical ethical issue that you'll be dealing with, but it is one that I think you need to be very carefully considering, and you need to be very open about it early on in your research project, because you don't want that to appear very late on in the piece, which means that you can't, you stop from continuing. Okay, so that basically concludes that experimental research A part, and now we're gonna just very briefly go over quasi-experimental research, which refers to non-randomized intervention studies. And another term used for quasi-experimental research is non-experimental research. So quasi-experimental research in engineering includes development or design of a product or system where the product can be software, material, equipment, or a process. And examples of such research include software design, transportation, construction management, manufacturing engineering, industrial engineering, and system engineering. In quasi-experimental research, there may be some cause and effect experiments, but the emphasis is on changes to the development or design process. And quasi-experiment designs include pre-test, post-test, time series, and cause studies. And there are two types of errors that are very common in this type of research, and they are the specification errors that refer to causes when relevant dependent variables are not identified nor included in the analysis. And the second one is the self-selection errors that arise because of the non-random assignment. So in other words, the assignment of the independent variable to specific categories is related to the status of the actual dependent variable. Okay, so what we're going to do now in the last part is focus on survey research, and then we're going to look at some particular issues that arise in survey research. And I think that survey research potentially has the biggest, the biggest potential for problems to arise. So I think I've included a couple of slides on this. So let's first just cover it very quickly, because I'm not sure whether you guys have done any of this already in your studies or not, or at least been exposed to it. So survey research involves analyzing information obtained from questionnaires or interviews. And the survey is usually conducted on a small sample of the population. The information obtained from survey research comprises facts, opinions, and behaviors. And it's very, very important to understand the difference between these three. And they're listed on the slide in front of you. A fact is an observable phenomenon or characteristic that can be verified completely independently. Opinion refers to the belief of the survey's subject, so the person that you're surveying. The belief can be preference, feeling, or behavioral intention. And very importantly, in contrast to a fact, an opinion cannot be verified independently. So that's a very, very important difference to understand. And behavior refers, so the third element, behavior, refers to the completed action of the survey's subject. Okay, so I think I've included here, so there's an example. For example, John has a GPA of 4.9 out of 5, and he never skips any classes. It is a fact that John has a GPA of 4.9. It is an opinion that John is a good student because he has a GPA of 4.9. Another opinion is John is a good student because he never skips classes. However, never skipping classes is a behavior. So that's something that I find personally really tricky, because I've worked on a lot of surveys in some of the previous work that I was involved in, and I've certainly been pulled up by people who picked up, very late down the track when I was presenting data, that the way that I'm interpreting parts of the surveys is not necessarily how they're seeing it, or that there are variables that I'm just not aware of because I was mixing up fact, opinion, and behavior. And it's very tempting to draw conclusions from surveys, because you usually have a hypothesis and you're trying to hit the darts and the bullseye. And I find this actually quite tricky, because it requires you to be very objective and to actually make sure that you're understanding the differences between fact, opinion, and behavior when you're trying to interpret it. And as I said, it is very, very tempting, because we're trying to come, like all roads lead to Rome. We've got this hypothesis and we've got an idea of where we're going to land, and it's very easy to kind of be misled. So that's a kind of a word of warning from me, and as someone who's definitely done these mistakes in the past. Okay, so let's quickly look at the types of surveys that you can encounter, so that you can work on. Surveys can be firstly conducted through electronic surveys, so mail surveys, telephone interviews, and face-to-face interviews. How you do that will really depend on the survey topic that you've got. As you can kind of imagine, that would really depend on the context that you find yourself in, and what you're trying to find out, and how you want to maneuver. It's very difficult, I guess, to have sort of a general view. It really will depend on what you're trying to achieve and what the hypothesis is that you've got, and you know, where your particular individual context. The bottom line is that the success of the survey research depends on sampling, measurement, and overall survey design. So these are the things that you know, I think if you can stay focused on, you're very likely to actually do pretty well. There are many different types of sampling techniques. So simple random sampling, cluster sampling, stratified sampling, systematic sampling, multi-stage sampling, convenient sampling, and purposive sampling. And there is a link for more details. Actually, I didn't include that link. It refers to a book, but even if you just go onto Google and Google any one of these terms, you'll be able to find out a lot of information. And often, if this actually does become part of your research project, whoever you're working with will be already kind of will have a fairly good idea in terms of what kind of survey they would like you to be involved in, what space to be involved in, and that's something that you can discuss with both your supervisors. And then once you've picked the particular technique that you think is useful, then you can do a bit more reading on that, and you can use, you can do some of the research techniques that we discussed yesterday to actually find out, what it is, how it's structured, and what is best practice. In terms of measurement errors, which are, as I said, very possible in this space. There are two types that are common. One is an observation error, and the other one is a non-observation error. So observation errors results from the way questions are posed, the characteristics of the survey subjects and the interviewers. Non-observation errors result from unrepresentative samples, sampling errors, and non-responses. I know that I personally have been involved in messing up on both fronts, particularly early on in my career as an academic developer, when I was actually being first introduced to this mode of research, where I made mistakes both in terms of how I actually set up the survey in the first place. So, things like the way I've asked questions, the way I've asked double-barreled questions, or actually missed to ask questions, and then how I infer data, but also in terms of missing out on entire, missing out on not only the type of things that I was asking, but also missing out on sampling and also not thinking about responses. So this is kind of quite it is quite tricky, I think, and to minimize observation errors, you need to really carefully consider your instrument. And the survey instrument refers to the topic, the instructions, the layout, and the order of the questions. So these are the kind of very important things to keep in mind. And you can minimize it through the following sort of simple tips. So if you want to minimize observation error, firstly, you need to very carefully think about the design of your questions, so that more specifically they're actually addressing your research, so they're not drifting off. If you have a question that's not really addressing a particular research, it shouldn't be in it, or you should ask yourself why it is in it in the first place. You need to also obviously think about anonymity and confidentiality. So that also comes hand in hand with the idea of thinking about response bias. So how are you actually, sending your where it's landing and who is answering those questions. So that's something that's also very important to think about. As I already mentioned, the layout of the survey question should be neat, clear, clean, and spacious. And I think probably the thing that's missing on the slide is also it needs to be logical, because I do think that sometimes it is important to think about why certain questions are asked at what point in the survey. So what is the sequencing? I think the logic you need to be able to explain the logic of the sequencing of the questions, why you ask question 1 at the beginning and question 10 last. And again, I've made mistakes like that in the past as well, or at least when someone else is observing and then making suggestions about my own bias based on the way I've sequenced the questions. They also should never be vague, and each question should have a frame of reference on how the survey subject should answer the question. The wording of the question should avoid negative words and double negatives. And again, I've definitely stuffed up with double negatives in the past as well. So you need to read each question and you need to get a supervisor or somebody else to actually read it and think about how they would interpret it. Because it's very simple, it's very easy to confuse, or it's very easy for you to have a particular understanding of what you're wanting to ask, and then the person who's reading it also not having another opinion. And actually, the best example of this is maybe how sometimes the university asks you to evaluate the teaching, how the university people ask that question, and the logic behind that and what they're actually trying to ask often varies from how students are interpreting the question. And we have a bit of a gap in between that. And at the moment, the body that is actually responsible for administering these surveys is actually admitting that there is a problem with that gap, particularly when it comes to different cohorts. So, for example, international students or domestic students. So that's a very important thing, and that's sort of an example that I can think of the top of my head. And you need to avoid double-barreled questions, which are questions that involve more than one issue, but allow only a single answer, and do not use words that may lead to response bias. And I found that very hard at the beginning, a hard road to learn, because I was picked up a couple of times that I was asking double-barreled questions, and I just couldn't understand why. But yeah, essentially what I was doing is I was actually packing issues into multiple issues without realizing into one question, but then only allowing somebody who is filling out the survey to give one answer, and then I would use that answer to justify one of those issues. But the problem that I had in that is that actually it might have been the other issue which was hidden in the question that somebody else was referring to, which actually nullifies what I'm trying to do. So that's another one to sort of think about carefully. Okay, I think we're going to finish off with the idea of minimizing the observation errors. So questions that you're asking can be both closed and open-ended, and we're just going to quickly cover the difference. So closed-ended questions require somebody to give an explicit response, and it's common to use a rating scale such as a Likert scale for the response. When using such a scale, consider provisions for a neutral response, so for those who are sitting on the fence and for those who are floating. So this is where essentially you need to embed into, because you're closing the questions, so it's closed-ended. You actually need to set it up so if the response is from 1 to 5, 1 being very sure and 5 being not sure at all, then there has to be something in between, and 3 for the category of someone who is somewhere in the middle. Open-ended questions require the survey subject to provide their own response. And usually open-ended questions are used when little is known of the topic, and responses to open-ended questions are time-consuming and difficult to analyze. And the reason that they're difficult to analyze is because you need to use discursive analysis to do that. And discursive analysis, it's a tool, a method used in qualitative research which essentially allows a researcher to sort of think about how language is constructed. So you look at language and you look at how language is used in particular ways and how language is used to create meanings. And that is very, very time consuming and very difficult to pull off if you don't have, you know, the know-how or the experience in that field. So closed-ended questions are much easier to administer. But having said that, open-ended questions are fantastic in terms of generating when you're trying to just get feedback. So they're really fantastic tool if you're just creating sort of feedback loops, because if you've got customers and if you're serving particular customers, it allows you to get insights into things that are not even on your radar in the first place. But in terms of research projects, open-ended questions can be very burdensome because you need to find a tool, a method, in order to evaluate that data and to then draw conclusions and generate meaning. So you need to be very aware of that. And here is the idea about ordering questions that I already alluded to, that, you know, the fact that the order is very important and should follow a very logical order. For example, the questions can be sorted into thematic categories and then separated into logical sections in the questionnaire. And you, again, need to be very careful that you're not actually, that your own bias is not in that sequence and in that logical order. Again, remember, you're going to have a hypothesis and you're probably trying to prove a hypothesis and you're trying to land your point. Make sure that you don't make the mistake that you're actually, you know, creating the sequencing in a biased way, which is pushing the respondents towards a particular response, because a reviewer can eventually pick up on that and argue that the data is not valid, or at least about the data is questionable or corrupted. And there's a hot tip here. Usually it's a good idea to pre-test the questionnaire with a small group before administering the questionnaire to the whole sample group. And that definitely is a very, very important point and a very hot tip. And not only should you be utilizing or running it past your supervisors if you're doing questionnaires, but also you should, you know, send it out and get some feedback on it before it actually goes out to the big group. So let's recap kind of what we have covered in this now nearly hour. We opened up by talking about what is actually a question, what is methodology. So we sort of looked at sort of methodology as opposed to method. And we concluded that methodology is this theoretical and philosophical framework of your particular research project. So it's that bigger picture. It's how you're generating meaning, where you are essentially making a decision whether you go down the quantitative pathway or whether you go down the qualitative pathway. We've kind of established that in the quantitative pathway, you are usually using deductive reasoning, which means that you're moving from, you know, generalized conclusion that is known to be true, and then you're going from that generalized conclusion that's known to be true to a specific conclusion of your own, which usually relates to a hypothesis. And in qualitative research, people use much more inductive reasoning, which means that they start with a specific and then they move from the specific in order to generalize about the bigger picture, and then they make a conclusion about the bigger picture. We also established that in engineering, you will most of the time be in using quantitative research methodology, which means that the methods that you use, so the methods, which remember are the technical or the procedural rules that you employ to generate your data. So the doing part of your study, the methods, that these methods can be divided into these three categories, which we have just covered basically in the last part of the presentation, and where I sort of stuck to the script quite a bit. And I'm sorry if some of you are a little bit bored, but I just wanted to make sure that you understand the sort of the general three ways in which you can flow. And we can conclude by saying that there is a third way to think about methodology, which is the mixed research method where you're applying both, and you already been seeing some potential to do that. If, for example, you were doing, if you opted in to do survey research, which is the third category of your experimental, quasi-experimental, and survey research. So if you're floating in that space, and for example you opt in to have open-ended questions, technically speaking, that leads you down the pathway of having a potentially having a mixed method research methodology, because you need to also make sense of these open-ended questions, because there is no way for you to actually make sense of those without entering into discursive analysis, and discursive analysis is qualitative methodology, which means you need to make sense of words. You need to create concepts out of these words, and to do that, you need to find you need to attach a meaning to the data that you're generating. They're not numbers; they're words. So you need to use other words and other systems of making sense of words to generate meaning for the data, and then suddenly you find yourself in that mixed research methodology. So that's it. It's we have now 30 minutes for some questions and answers. And what I would encourage you to do is, if there is some of you who have already, and it sounds like there are some because we spoke about it yesterday, who already been talking about potential projects, and who have been thinking about how they could be running a project in the firm, but also how that could be part of a research project. This is your chance now to kind of share, and then we can just sort of go with the flow and see where that takes us. Thank you. I want to stop sharing the screen just so that I can see if there are questions. So Eddie has just tuned out. We'll wait for him. In the meantime, I'll wait for some questions if you've got them. If you don't, I can sort of start with a small overview of what we're going to do for the rest of the week. So I'll keep an eye on these questions. So please type them in, or you can also talk if you feel more, whatever you're more comfortable with. But in the meantime, I'll just give you a bit of an overview of what we're planning for the rest of the week.
Hi, this is Luke.
Hey, Luke.
I was just wondering, it keeps coming up, our academic advisors. Do we need to organise to partner up with someone at the uni, or is that just you guys who are going to be supporting us? What's the plan there?
Yeah, so I think that Eddie is going to join in a moment, but I'm pretty sure that the plan is that there is, I think, 5 people that have been identified in your department as academic supervisors, and you're all going to be assigned. Everybody in your group will be assigned with one academic from your department, and the expectation is that you will be meeting with them once a fortnight using Zoom. Or if you happen to be in the same place and you feel like you want to meet them, I think it will be between you and your supervisors to arrange. And the way that you're going to be utilizing them. Were you there in the first one, Luke, in the presentation on Monday?
No, I'll be listening to that one on Saturday probably.
So if you're listening on Monday, you'll see that Eddie has sort of provided you with a bit of a rough timeline of what you need to do. Between now and the next 4 weeks particularly, and part of that includes the discussion of what you need to do with your supervisors, because you're going to need to work with your academic supervisors in order to finalize your proposal. So you can go back to webinar 1, and then that particular question will be covered. So can I then ask, since you're much quieter than you were yesterday, whether, like, for most of you, what I've just presented, is this something that you would have come across in your previous studies already, or is this for most of you now sort of like a sledgehammer over top of your head?
I wouldn't say it's a sledgehammer. We've definitely covered some similar subjects, but I don't recall ever going into so much detail before.
Okay. So partly for me, when I was thinking about how to pull this particular one off, which was a little bit tricky, because I know that no one has written a report like this before, so this is definitely a step up in terms of writing a particular research report. Hasn't been done. The thing is that when we look at methodology, obviously, since you're engineers and we discuss sort of, how engineers create methods to make, generate data, you would have come across some of these stuff in your studies, surely, because that's how data gets generated. The thing about this particular webinar, and why it was very important to sort of present to you is that there's a difference between reading about this in your studies and reading other academics and other engineers, and actually going on about setting up your own research project and writing about it. And methods are very, very important because they're a crucial part of your actual report that you're going to be writing, as I said, but also because they set up your journey at the beginning. So you actually can't even write your proposal if you don't really understand. Remember when we covered proposals yesterday, methods were in that. Methodology and methods were part of the proposal. So you can't have your hypothesis without actually understanding or being clear about the methodology and the method that you're going to use to generate the data to actually test that hypothesis. So in a way, it's a very basic thing that, the points that we looked at are quite basic. But on the other hand, they are very structured. Methods in quantitative research are very structured, and you need to follow them. So that's partly why I opted not to go off the script very much when I spoke about methods as opposed to methodology, where I was being a little bit more philosophical. And the reason for that is because it is a more philosophical kind of discussion. Methodology is a much more higher up sort of discussion about knowledge and what it means and how you find, how you make sense of the world around you. Whereas methods is a formula of how you do things. So whatever you decide, you need to make sure that you're very comfortable in that space and that you understand the rules of engagement. Because if you don't understand the rules of engagement, you can be picked up on it later on. So you can spend a lot of time and effort in generating, beautiful data sets and writing out beautifully in your report and synthesizing in a really good way. But then if one of the variables is off, or if the way you've generated data is not correct, then the whole house can crumble, actually. Which is why, it's, as I said, it's very important to go back to the slides. Once you pick a particular methodology, then go and read up a little bit more and make sure that you feel very comfortable with it. Any other questions, guys? Eddie, do you have anything to add? All right, then, if there are no questions, let me just quickly introduce you, since we've got a little bit of time, to what we're going to do for the rest of the week. So I'll just share my screen quickly. So what we're going to do next tomorrow is actually run through, so we're going to look a little bit at the sort of technical side of the writing process. So even though it's quite early in, you still have to write your proposal, technically speaking, and some of you have even not started in your on your placements. But it's very important to understand some of the trickery around writing reports. And the reason why we're going to have an entire webinar on this is because, as I mentioned early on in the week, you can, have a wonderful project that you're leading, and you can have a really great research project, but if you're not able to write a report, you can't write a report. And the reality of the jobs that you're going to be doing is that you're going to have to be able to do this. So report writing will be part of your life, for the rest of your professional life. So what we're going to focus on tomorrow is on the sort of technical aspects of writing from an engineering perspective. So we're not going to cover, basic things like, spelling, sentence structure, syntax, etc. Writing paragraphs, all of these things, because it will be a bit of a waste of the time. And if you're struggling with that, the reality is that the webinar will not be able to help you. If you are struggling with these type of things, as I said, it's very important to seek help early on. And the best way to do that is to go and seek help from the appropriate people at La Trobe. And I think in all of the libraries, you have the drop-in services where you can get some, you can actually want one-on-one support from another peer in terms of how to write reports. And they'll have people who actually will be able to focus on report writing in specific, which is really good. And I'd encourage you to sort of, seek out that help. Tomorrow, we're actually going to look at, real technical things from an engineering perspective, and hopefully that will take off some of the ease of some of the people that are worried about how you actually pull together, how you pull together the writing. And some of the things are very basic, but also very important. And I remember when I started my PhD, I wished that at the beginning of my process I had done a similar induction, because even things like how to get started and how to write the first draft, how to keep timelines, how to structure things, how to begin the process itself. All of these things were very, very time consuming for me, because I just didn't receive any guidance at the start. And the reason we decided to have this particular webinar is because we just want to make sure that you can actually get off to the start very quickly. So that's what's going to be happening tomorrow. And then on Friday, we're going to look in a lot of detail at the actual structure of the 4 components of the main body of your report. And as I said, one of those components will be methodology and methods. So you're going to be able to see how it actually looks in a thesis. And I'm going to give you an example as well, someone writing the methods actually, and a section of the methods, so that you can see, okay, this is actually what it looks like. So that this kind of general and theoretical component of the webinar today actually makes sense, because you're going to see what it looks like in action. So that's basically it. All right, so this is the final chance to to ask any questions. Otherwise, we will call it quits, and we finished a bit earlier.
Hi, Damir. This is Nawaz.
Yes, Nawaz.
Yes. Seems like the project plan, it's supposed to be 2,500 words. And when I review that, the example, the one that has been given, it looks like way more effort put into actually describing about the scope. So it's like analyzing everything and then proposing some budget out there. And what are the sources that, in case if it involves some cost, should that be the universities should be funding in? I mean, like I can have reviewed the entire scope for the one that is given in the example in the assessment one in LMS.
Yes, so it's your question, because that's a very important question, and that is, and particularly for those of you who have not listened to yesterday's webinar and have tuned in today and haven't listened to the recording. Let me just paraphrase your question, and you tell me whether I understand you correctly. You're wondering about some of the differences between what I presented yesterday in terms of how to structure a proposal and the actual instructions of how to write a proposal that Eddie has uploaded on the LMS. Is that right?
What I mean is, there is an example report on the LMS. After looking into that and reviewing that report clearly, I can find that there has been involved a lot more work in the scope itself. and it seems like actually assigning some budget for the project cost or something like that. So I was willing to ask if there is some cost involved in doing this project or the research analysis in the company. So
Okay, I can help answer that question. I'm sorry, I'm just outside. It's a bit windy here.
Yeah.
So the examples that you're given are supposed to be a lot more comprehensive than what you may have to do. But the point is that you've got something there that includes a budget. You don't necessarily need to include a budget in what you're doing, but you can. For example, if on the job you're asked to actually cost up a particular job, it might be doing some research to see what the most viable solution for something is, then you may have a budget included as part of what it is that you're doing. But whatever it is that you're doing, remember what I mentioned in the webinar the other day. I talked about time. Time equals money. You're no longer in a university environment where you're a student, so therefore time is not so important in this case. Time is of the essence now, because every hour that you spend doing research on something is costing the company X dollars. And every hour that you propose that something needs to be done is going to cost the company hours. So you need to take that into consideration when we talk about budgets. When you're conducting research, now you need to include the actual dollars involved, right? Whatever it is that you're proposing, the company will need to take that into consideration. So perhaps we're not talking about buying a piece of equipment, but it might be human hours involved. So the human hours will equate to dollars, and you need to take that in consideration as part of your budget. Because the proposal that you're putting together isn't just for us at the university, it's also something that the industry supervisors are going to have to agree with. And so if it's going to take you 400 hours out of your workday to do that, perhaps that's not something they want to do, right? So once you start getting into what it is that you're going to research, a lot of these things will become a lot more clearer as you go forward. But do not take the examples as word for word how your report needs to look, because that's not the point of the actual examples. The examples are there just guidelines, and your report can look a whole lot different. But what is important is structure. It needs to follow a certain structure. You might have more details in one section than another, but the structure has to be very similar. Because once it's structured in that way, it's very easy for us to follow what it is that you're trying to propose, what it's going to cost, who's involved, what are the risks involved, what are the timelines involved, what does the literature say that you should be doing, and so on. You need to be able to make that argument. Hopefully that clarifies a little bit on that question.
Yep, got you. Thank you.
And similarly, just to add to that, I remember that what we're trying to attempt to do with a series of webinars here is to make sure that you understand what a classic research project looks like in academia as part of a university degree, because that's something that you need to be able, we need to prove that you're able to do that. So partly what I'll be doing here is to explaining to you what classical research methodology and method looks like in engineering, and a research project, what it would look like in engineering. But your context is different to that classical example. You are placed in a company at the time of the writing. And as Eddie said, all of these things that he mentioned are valid around time, and it's an authentic experience that you're going through. So you need to think about these webinars as doing two things. One, making sure that you understand the basics of research projects in engineering. And secondly, that they give you enough information to trigger your imagination to actually write a very good practical report at the end of your experience in your company. So these webinars are solely here so that they set you up to be on the right pathway, and that you write a report that is the best that you can do. You don't need to copy the templates. Indeed, you shouldn't be copying some of the templates, because your report will look probably very different. But what we're going to be looking for in the reports is that the right method is there, that the logic is there, that the structure is there, and that the report is sound, and that it's influenced by all of these principles that we're discussing in the webinars. So I hope that part, makes sense for you guys. So always think through these two ways to think about it. One is that you're really getting an insight what a proper research project looks like. And secondly, this information is helping you to write a very good final report, practical report that will make sense to both your academic supervisor, but also, more importantly, to your industry supervisor, because it means that it relates to the world out there. Okay, any final questions or comments? All right, then maybe we will leave it at this. So we're going to finish at 15:15, so 1 hour and 15 minutes. Eddie, I hope you're able to stop recording. I don't know if you already stopped recording. I think you have. But thanks all very much for your time. And I will see you tomorrow all at 7 o'clock. So we are on at the same time. And Eddie, if you want to do any final words, go for it.
Sorry, Damir, there is one final question I can see on the chat here. I think we might have missed it.
Okay, I haven't seen it.
It's from Tyson. He said, is the IP developed as part of the research separate from the IP developed in the day-to-day functions in the workplace? Good question, Tyson. Again, yes and no. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It depends what it is that you're doing. But the IP that you're developing is still considered the IP of the company, whichever way you look at it. So the research that you do could be part of your day-to-day work, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It really depends. We have to play it by ear a little bit because it's the first time we're doing it this way. I think most companies are open to the idea, but some companies will be more open to the idea because their day-to-day work is actually R&D, whereas opposed to others, it might be 20% research, 80% execution. So we have to see how things pan out. But when you have a better idea of what things are looking like, we'll be able to answer that question a whole lot better.